Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to wrap up today with a special selection, which is where one of you tell me exactly what it is I need to check out. Today's comes at us from Teacup, FN 380 ACP number 19074 by 1914. There's a lot of numbers in that. The black and death metal band from Ukraine with songs about the Great War. After reading the lyrics, you can probably guess what the title means. And I thought it was really interesting that they only write about the Great War or First World War or World War One, depending on who you are and where you're from. Because the band is 1914, which is the year I think when World War One kicked off. So the album art for this too, I wish I should have just made a way to showcase this. Anyways, it's just a reaper going through some trenches with a bunch of soldiers. And so I went and looked up what this title meant. And apparently this is the bullets and the weapon registration of the guns that were used to assassinate Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke. And many historians have agreed that this is the specific event that was the match onto the powder keg that ignited World War One. So yeah, everything about this just shows a bit of detail and research into the events, as well as the band title just being the year that it happened. Really being fascinated by this time apparently. So let's dive into this. FN 380 ACP number 19074. Got the strings in the background. French horn too? Trombone. There's the blackened bit. Got the 16th note basses, our bass kicks, the fast guitar picking. Eighth note snare hits right here. Heavily layered vocals, more than I would expect from I don't know where I was going with that. very theatric. Yeah, using the 16th note bass kicks as a section of the riff is a nice change of pace. I love the various attacks on the ride cymbal here. All right. All right, so the black metal part is, or I should just say the metal part is, it's typical. There's a lot of 16th notes going on in the guitars. They are typically playing one note at a time for an elongated section. If we mapped out the notes only when they change pitch, we're going to be looking at a lot of half and whole notes, which are longer in length. It only feels quicker because there's so many strokes per pitch. The drumming, there is a lot of blast beats. There is ride cymbal accentuated lines that go against double bass kicks, 16th notes on those. We do have a couple of halftime feels that stick along with this rigidity. There is one punkier idea where we get bass kicks on the end of beats, which is between beats, while our snare is on the downbeat of them. So we have this bass snare bass kind of idea, and then usually a pocket, and then another bass snare bass, and kind of has this galloping sound going on. To me, that's very punky, but it also kind of works for this idea, right? It's this rigid movement forward. Galloping, at least for me, I typically think of horses, but it's just, like I said, it could be extrapolated into just a general idea of forward movement. Um, and that, I mean, that pretty much sums up what the drums are doing in every section throughout here. Bass, what bass? If there was a bass, they were following in line with what the guitar was doing, but this is such a huge sound between the largeness of the guitars, we'll talk about in a second, the layers in the vocals, the volume of the drums, and On the outside of all that, we also have our brass and violin section. It's it's a big production in a tiny space. It still feels very close to typical death metal production. So it's clear, but it's small. Uh, and it's a little bigger, though, I'll say, than most death metal, but it's still not going for the full orchestral hall kind of sound um, with just a very large sound sphere. It went for more of a medium-sized sound sphere, and so there's just not really a lot of room for the bass to shine through in a genre where the bass has difficulty shining through, anyways. Um, but given the lack of complexity in the guitar work outside of the sheer muscle endurance of playing the 16th notes throughout an entire track, much less an entire set live. Um, compositionally though, it's not an exceptionally deep guitar line. I'm going to assume the bass line is going to be rather similar in that it's probably doing something very close to what the guitars are doing, just probably less often. Maybe not doing 16th notes, but eighth notes or quarter notes, and sticking to root tones of possibly the chord or playing the same melody that the guitars are playing. But a majority of the time, the guitars are playing chords anyways, so it wouldn't make a lot of sense for the bass to lean into that as well. The other part we have to talk about of the metal section is the vocals, of course, and these are hyper layered. We got to hear for about a second at the end, I think, a solo line of vocals, and it was as he was kind of coming off of the growl and coming down into just that fry crackle and letting the intensity reduce itself until it kind of just becomes a little bit of a snarl almost. And I think that was the only time we actually got to hear the vocals by themselves with minimal production on them. And they are a bit on the weaker side, but I don't know if we can extrapolate that because the song was coming down to a close, the vocals were coming down as well. But it is, like I said, the only time I think we get to hear the raw or something close to the raw vocals. Otherwise, what we get is very large, very layered. There is at least two different harsh vocal types coming out. We have more of a something closer to a growl that's pushed to the outsides, and then we have that higher pitched, raspier black metal style thing going on in the center. But it's not just centered. It kind of bleeds out to the side. So there's almost this overlap where it feels very pointed in the center, and as you listen further out to the sides, it becomes rather wider. Yeah, it's not covering as much of a narrow sound anymore. Um, and that's just moving from that really directed nasally harsh out to that wider growl. And I think it's a really neat, almost like an auditory gradient. It's pretty neat how they ended up doing it, and it's also very tastefully produced. It's only because I was really looking at it. That's the whole point of me listening to music here is to listen to it with a lot more attention than most people are going to listen to it casually. I really don't think it's something you're going to pick up. It feels like a unified sound overall, and it's not as overpowering as I describe it. It does take up a lot of space though, but fortunately it sits, like I said, well, I haven't said this yet. I get ahead of myself sometimes. It sits a bit higher than the band, so it has its own little space up here, which is really nice. But it feels like the growl kind of pulls itself down into the band, and so we get this really nice, again, like a gradient effect. We don't have just how the vocals feel going across the x-axis, but also how they feel against the mix of the band, and everything's just a very smooth movement and connectiveness to everything. And I really appreciate that. There's a lot of work that went into the vocals, both in the recording of them and in the mixing of them, and then, of course, mixing them into the music and having the music mixed and all that. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of places it could go wrong. Producer definitely deserves a bit of a shout out here as well for their contributions to making this sound as good and as effortless as it does. Death metal tends to have a little bit better production than black metal, but this could easily have had a bit of a grittier, dirtier production, and I think it still would have found an audience, just something closer to the black metal group of fans than necessarily mm, the larger metal group. I don't want to necessarily separate black metal out as its own thing, but metal as a whole tends to have cleaner, if yet still dirty, productions where they get the grit and the grime of uh, the distortion and the compression, but they keep everything clean where you can still hear everything. Black metal is just, it's that genre that doesn't care how bad, how low fidelity their uh, uh, production gets. They're still fans for it. And I'm sure that exists everywhere. It just feels like black metal fans are a lot more lenient on production. In fact, some of them crave worser. I was going to say raw, but sometimes it's not even raw. Sometimes there's a lot of production that goes into it to make it sound bad. And I'll put bad in quotations. It's not objectively bad, but um, you know, low fidelity. I think that's the proper term we should use for it. And yeah, so like I said, there's just a lot of effort that goes into the production here that gives it a palatability that I don't think it would have if it leaned more into its black metal roots. Um, so yeah, that's our metal side. And I think if that's where the song ended, I'd be walking away from it with a lot less interest. But they pull in a symphonic element. And not that they're using a full symphony, but a symphonic metal element. In which case, interestingly, we have more brass than strings. Usually the strings are going to be dominant, and if a band wants to use brass as well, they sort of support what the strings are doing. Um, or they're equal footing. But here the brass really outshines the strings, and I think it's because we have a fullish brass section. We definitely have tuba. I heard the trombone slide. Uh, it doesn't necessarily need to be a trombone, but it's a very smooth slide in the trombone's range, so that's where I'm going to go with that. Possibly French horn. I still think I heard the French horn timbre, but I'm not 100% on it. When we got the isolated symphonic elements there about 3 minutes into the track, I didn't hear the French horn, but the combination of the trumpets and actually more specifically, I think the trombones with the violin, especially with the metal band on top of it, kind of erasing some of the more subtle nuances of the coloring of those instruments, when they come together into a unified sound, kind of has a French horn thing going on. I'm not going to say if you listen to them in isolation, you'd be like, oh, yeah, that sounds just like one. But I think with all the other stuff going on around it and the fact that it's pushed into the background a bit, I think that might have been what I was confusing for a French horn. But yeah, we definitely have trumpet, tuba, and trombone. I don't know about a French horn. I don't know about a baritone. And then we had violins, which is interesting. It's not a string section like we had in our brass section. It's literally just a violin section. There's a few of them. It gives it that extra weight and power. It's not a solo violin. But there's no violas. There's no cellos. I didn't hear any contrabass. So that's an interesting choice. Um, More interestingly, also, is that the brass seems to be pushed to the right and the violins were pushed to the left, which gave them equal weighting as far as the production went. But there's the brass sound should have been so much louder. So that was an interesting balancing decision there. As for the composition of this stuff, a lot of it's just chords. We do get a bit of melody, especially when we get the symphonic element isolated, but it's really just atmosphere and texture. Um, some beautiful semi-moving lines to go on top of our black metal rigidity and lack of movement to widen out the overall, I'd say, like, color of the song, where the black metal section is pretty one note. They don't really change much of what's going on there. We do get some metric things, like we have the halftime and we have the punky drumming idea, but harmonically and melodically, what the guitars are doing, not a lot of stuff going on there. So the symphonic section is a way to bring in something semi-melodic to the track that the metal band isn't. They're primarily textural um, throughout this entire song. And so it does utilize the symphonic instruments in a way that I find underutilizes them. It's the same criticism I have for a lot of symphonic metal bands who bring in, strings to play chords and just to have that string timbre to go with their song to make it sound, yeah, we're not all metal kind of thing going on. But I think it kind of works here because there is a weight to the music and especially to the topic that having the theatric element, I think, helps sell. In the past, I have found pure black metal bands who sing about real events. And since it's black metal, the events always have to be tragic or extreme or grotesque or something. And so a world war definitely fits into that. It's one of the most tragic events we've had on this planet in recent times. Yeah, that lines up perfectly with what a black metal or even a death metal band would sing about. But the music itself, just that metal, I think it's not dynamic enough, and it always kind of feels cheesy. It's missing the oomph to help sell what they're talking about. And so while I do wish that the brass and string did something a bit more for a majority of this track, I think simply having them changes the atmosphere of the song in a way for the better. It's not just about having them, they actually support the ideas that the lyrics are leaning into. And it gives it that extra power and width and theatricality that I think works for telling stories about this horrible event. It brings the weight in a way that four instruments and a vocalist just don't typically, regardless of production. So let's see if the lyrics can back up any of this extra support that the strings are bringing in. So I can't say that I was expecting much more based on the few lyrics I did pick up checking out the music video, but it's interesting because it's told from a first person perspective of the assassin, Franz Ferdinand's assassin. But it's also completely devoid of detail or nuance. There is a whole 15 lines here, and most of them are just welcome to Sarajevo. Uh, yeah, that's six of them right there. At the beginning, we have 4 lines, give or take, setting up the story. It says, one day the empire will fall, Kaiser will die, assassination is the path, terror is the way to divide, a tyrant's overthrow is the only acceptable way. So it sets up what's going to happen. And then we have 8 or so lines dedicated to a retelling of the assassination through the eyes of the assassin. Including, which I think is interesting, specific prejudices and opinions that this person might have had or has even gone on record to have, which I think is an interesting addition. It's not a cleansed retelling of this, and it includes some of the thoughts that the assassin had and what caused them to go through with the assassination. But it's all very surface level, and even in some ways might even be seen as gratuitous, as well as far as some of the descriptions go of how the event went down. But beyond that, it doesn't seem to handle the topic with any sort of gravity. It seems to be just a story for the lyrics to be about. And maybe that's just the way I'm reading it. Definitely, if you have a different perspective on the lyrics, let me know. But it's so surface level, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't fit the theatricality that the music's going for. This doesn't feel grand at all. And honestly, maybe it wasn't. The assassination happened at a sandwich shop. And if I remember correctly, Franz Ferdinand's envoy had to take a detour and happened to just pass by, and because the first assassination attempt was blocked or something, and he couldn't take the shot, and he thought he had failed and went and got a sandwich, and Franz Ferdinand came up and stopped in front of the sandwich shop, and he had his opportunity now. That might be a bit reductive, but I think that's generally what happened. And so maybe the fact that this isn't grand is a part of that. Maybe 1914's other lyrics do blow things up into a sort of weight that the events demand, and maybe they just didn't think this one did because of how mundane it kind of was. I don't know if you can call an assassination mundane, but it wasn't this big plan that was executed perfectly. It was, like I said, just sitting at a sandwich, eating his failure sandwich. Oh, that's my target. He just happens to be here. That kind of thing. Maybe mundane's the wrong word for that, but the music, though, has a weight to it that I just think the lyrics don't have that same level of respect. But again, that just might be my perspective and how I'm reading it. Those are my thoughts on 1914's FN 380 ACP number 19074. That is a title, man. It's fine. I think in text it is a mouthful to say though. There's got to be a better way to shorten that. But it's acronyms and numbers. Like, how do you shorten that? Unless you just say like FN 380. I suppose that's a good stopping point. Anyways, what are your thoughts on this? Let me know down in the descriptions. Nope. Let me know down in the comments. Above the comments in the description box is a link to Linktree. Takes you to this menu. You can find links to my music, a link to the Discord server, ways to support the channel, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. That wraps it up for today. We'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC as usual. We'll continue on with this week's theme of unlikely features. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.